You're with Clement Manyathela.
702. Let's walk the talk.
So last week we started a new series on the show. We do it every Monday, just after the 10:30 headlines, where we look at multilateral institutions. Last week we focused on the United Nations. And today we are discussing the World Bank. And you'll pick up that a lot of these multilateral institutions were actually created after World War II. And with the bank, I mean, its original mandate was reconstruction and development. But over time, its focus has shifted from post-war reconstruction to poverty reduction, your development finance, economic reform in developing countries. And the influence of a bank like the World Bank has always sparked debate. That's why you've got, two people on the sides of this debate. You've got those who support, right, initiatives of the World Bank, and they will argue to you that the bank has helped lift millions out of poverty. They've helped build infrastructure, roads, schools, power stations, you name it, especially in developing countries. And you've got others on the other side, critics who argue it often, the loans or funds coming from the World Bank often come with strings attached, right, with policy conditions that reshape the national economies and sometimes even deepen inequality. What have been your observations of the World Bank? You can call us or send us a WhatsApp voice note, but someone who knows more about this institution is Professor Patrick Bond. We've invited him to come chat to us more about the World Bank organization. He's the political economist and professor at UJ's Department of Sociology. Professor Bond, thank you for making time for us. Good morning.
Warm greetings, Clement, and all to your listeners as well.
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. What necessitated the establishment of the World Bank? What are its origins and the original purpose?
Yeah, the original purpose, as you said, is to make project loans, that is reconstruction and development. And as you've said, then they branched out into broader structural adjustment loans in the 1980s. But back in 1944, we have some fingerprints that we should identify, those of Jan Smuts, because a man called John Maynard Keynes was representing all of the debtor countries at the big negotiations called Bretton Woods. That was in New Hampshire, Mount Washington Hotel. And John Maynard Keynes thought his old friend from 1919, the Versailles Treaty they got together, his old friend Jan Smuts would side with the debtors, but instead, because South Africa had half the world's gold here underneath us in Johannesburg, a radius of a couple of 100K, well, we found it at the time. Let's say white South Africans found it more amenable to be a sub-imperial power with the imperial U.S. that basically put together this World Bank in a manner, especially the International Monetary Fund, the sister institution, that went against the interests of the debtors, Britain and the Commonwealth and all of the other countries that had gone into debt during World War II. And instead, South Africa sided because the other half of the world's gold was in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and the U.S. had centralized it during World War II. So that's why even our foreign minister in the 2010s, Maite Nkoana-Mashabane, she was so critical of the way that South Africa helped for white power, for the gold industry, to essentially put the U.S. dollar at the center of the world. And that's the Bretton Woods fingerprint. I think we have to acknowledge and say, yeah, that was quite an historic mistake because the U.S., of course, has abused it. And, of course, the World Bank, even though it was doing regular loans at the time, South Africa was the second major country after Colombia to get World Bank loans. And it was racist. It was for Eskom. It was for Transnet. And those were under conditions of apartheid where Transnet was really taking migrant workers into the cities and the farms, the fields, the mines, but especially Eskom building huge coal-fired power plants. But how many black people were getting access to World Bank financing? None, because Eskom was a racist institution. And that's one of the most interesting problems. How do you go back and do some reparations? We've asked the World Bank many times. Of course, they say, no, we don't owe anything for profiting from apartheid loans.
That's quite fascinating, Professor Bond, and thanks for mentioning that. How does this institution operate, though? Like, what's the governance structure looking like? Is there voting power? Who runs it?
Yes, well, the U.S. has the presidency, they've always said this is, it's like do you remember the old signs, Europeans only? The European only sign that they took from the beaches during apartheid, they put that on the International Monetary Fund managing director door. So the IMF is always run by some European financier or economist, and the World Bank is run by someone with an American citizenship. And at the moment, it's a man born in India, but he was the head of MasterCard. His name's A.J. Banga. Interestingly, a dozen years ago, he got a major start in his international career by working in Soweto to give out MasterCard credit cards.
Oh, interesting.
Well, debit cards, to be frank, that was part of the social grant. But the problem is they partnered with another World Bank subsidiary called Cash Paymaster Services. Wow, did they loot the poorest people? 17 million people suddenly started getting massive debit cards. 6-year-old girls getting microfinance and cell phone contracts and burial society. They kind of put all these debits on so that MasterCard would make lots of money, Cash Paymaster Services, CPS. And of course, they abused people so much that Black Sash, the wonderful NGO representing the poor, came in and literally pushed them into bankruptcy by saying, stop that. And so CPS died, although its parent company, Net1, is still alive. But I really do blame the World Bank for predatory finance in that particular project. There are plenty of others. We critics, we don't like the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, the real original corruption, and the fact that here in Johannesburg, where we have water problems now, we have World Bank loans from last November, and yet the old corruption in building the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, including some of the construction companies that went on to build the stadiums for the World Cup that were subject to collusion. This is a kind of culture of corruption at the World Bank. The worst case would be the World Bank's financing of Medupi. That was the biggest loan ever, 3.75 billion. And we're still paying the damages any one of us buying electricity.
But Prof, is the corruption coming from the World Bank, or is it more the politicians and the people who facilitate the loans they receive from the World Bank?
Yeah, the case against Medupi, the biggest case of corruption probably in Africa in terms of the damage, the load shedding, the cost overruns from 60 billion rand to 240 billion, the same for Kusile. We can blame that on Hitachi bribing, according to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, when it was being prosecuted during the Obama administration in the U.S., which Hitachi then did a settlement and basically was guilty of, and that was bribing the African National Congress through Vali Musa, who was the chair of ESCOM, who got a slap on the wrist for it. It was a sort of failure to declare conflict of interest because he was also on the ANC Finance Committee, and it was, of course, Hitachi saying to Chancellor House, hey, take 25% of our local ownership of our Hitachi Power Africa, and then you make sure we get the contract. So that's been well proven, and unfortunately it hasn't been prosecuted because the Zondo Commission was asleep at the wheel on that one. But, we definitely need to go back and say, World Bank, you knew about it, the DA, Business Day, the establishment here said, don't make that loan. That's the biggest loan you've ever made. And the president at the time, named Robert Zelle, just ignored all of these voices saying, if you make this loan for Medupi and then ultimately also for Kusile, South Africa is going to be in an electricity crisis for more than a decade, right? And unfortunately, we were saying that 150 civil society groups led by South Urban Community Environmental Alliance and Groundwork, and they were sort of saying, don't make this loan. We need more reliable energy, not coal-fired. It'll wreck the climate. We need solar, and that's the way the World Bank should be financing. The other big question, should we be financing with foreign loans for many of the projects, like Marikana for housing? The World Bank had a $150 million loan. It was basically Cyril Ramaphosa, then the head of the Transformation Committee at Lomin, and because they were promising 5,500 houses, only 3 were built. But, that was in a hard currency loan, right? We don't need dollars to build houses. We have our own local labor, local materials. Those are the sorts of questions raised.
Okay.
High interest rates as the rand falls. Lots of problems. The World Bank really owes us all an enormous amount.
Do wealthier countries have a more louder voice based on the governance structure? Do they wield disproportionate influence like we see in other multilateral institutions?
Exactly. And like the IMF, the United States, the Treasury, right, the Finance Ministry, has been dogmatic that they want to control more than 15% of the vote, and that way they can put a veto on anything. So it's quite interesting because there is a rise in BRICS financing, especially the IMF, but also the World Bank. And that means that China, for example, the last time that they recapitalized, about a decade ago, they got more money into the IMF, partly to deal with that huge financial crisis in the early 2010s and 2008-9, and that continued. So then the BRICS got more voting power, but unfortunately, they did it not to bring the U.S. under the 15% level, the veto range, but they did it at the expense of African countries. Nigeria lost 41%, Venezuela lost 41%, even South Africa lost 21% of our votes there. So you can see it's a changing, evolving situation where we have a new, I'd say, a sub-imperial layer of financiers. They say they're trying to reform, the BRICS. We want to see de-dollarization, new institutions, and new ways of doing business internationally. But the harsh reality is that they're just buying into the existing system, and in fact, I'd argue making it worse.
Yeah. 9 minutes now before 11 o'clock. We'll continue our conversation with Professor Patrick Bond after the break. If you've got questions yourself, you're welcome to call us or send us a WhatsApp voice note on 0727021702. Or maybe if you just want to join the conversation, you've made your own observations about how the World Bank operates. Have we benefited? Have we benefited positively, negatively? What do you think has been the contribution of the World Bank to countries like ours, developing countries?
702.
The Clement Manyathela Show.
Let's walk the talk.
7 minutes before 11 o'clock, we're speaking to Professor Patrick Bond about the World Bank organization. We have been looking at these multilateral institutions. Why were they formed? How have we benefited from them? What's the governance structure like? And what are the reforms that are needed in these multilateral institutions? And Professor Bond, speaking of the reforms, which is something you mentioned before we went to break, de-dollarization has also been really a subject of debate. Some countries complain that when we take loans from the World Bank, they are dollar denominated, and when you have to pay back that loan, you spend a lot of time paying interest before you even get to the loan itself. And some developing countries find this to be unfair. Is that one of the issues, listed in as we discuss the reform of the World Bank, and what are the others?
It's terribly important because, of course, when we took that loan from the World Bank from Adupi in 2010, the rand to the dollar, I think our strongest point was 6.3 rand to the dollar. And then the rand crashed during the 2010s with such bad governance from Jacob Zuma's administration. And so then it went down as low as 20. And I think we're at 16.5 today. But the point is that when you take a loan out, the repayment is in dollars. And when your currency falls, then the effective interest rate goes way up. The World Bank doesn't want to take South African rands. It doesn't want to sort of be repaid in currency. And you know what John Maynard Keynes, when he was really trying his best as this kind of British representative, the top economist in the world at the time, he said, no, if you're going to set up project loans with hard currency, the dollars, the euros, then make sure that you've got export capacity that results from the project so that you can repay in hard currency. You're not just sucking in a lot of hard currency dollars that may finance luxury imports for the elites in the country, but you're then really squeezed and you have to drop your currency so you can export more. And unfortunately, that basic rule from 1944 has been lost along the way. So we get ridiculous financing, like for education, basic education loans. But what is the foreign input on that? Very, very little. And those are the sorts of things that make people think, well, we need more local currency financing. Unfortunately, the BRICS New Development Bank, which was set up in 2015 to be an alternative, they haven't really moved. They've got 73% of their loans in dollars and Swiss franc and euros instead of in the local currencies. They're moving slowly. There's a president there called Dilma Rousseff. She was formerly Brazil's president. She's realized this is ridiculous to be charging when most of our BRICS currencies, the exception being China and India, are falling in value. And so then the effective interest rate is too high. And as I said, for most of our countries in BRICS, we actually don't need Forex. We've got a huge bubble in the stock market here. We've got the highest, what's called capitalization of the shares to GDP, the Buffett ratio, in the world. So there's a hugely liquid financial pool here that could be drawn on with prescribed assets and hopefully lower interest rates if we could tighten exchange controls. And those would be ways that you could avoid going to a World Bank or even a BRICS bank.
Okay. I get it. So we also have these institutions that are coming up, like I'm thinking of the New Development Bank, for instance. I mean, that has been rising. Is that what developing countries are looking to as their hope for a reformed global financial, sort of institutional environment?
Unfortunately, it hasn't worked, and I take it not from being an insider, but one of my colleagues in Brazil, Paulo Batista Nogueira, was one of the founding vice presidents. He's exposed the internal workings, and it's a really shocking institution. Even our own first vice president, who served more than 10 years, Leslie Maastrup, had worked in Bank of America and Citibank and privatizing assets. So we're talking about mentalities of those in the BRICS Bank and in the BRICS financial districts in Johannesburg, Sandton, in Sao Paulo, in Shanghai, and Mumbai. Most of these financial districts have westward-gazing, dollar-centric bankers. And unfortunately, the BRICS Bank has done both, I think, like the World Bank, hard currency loans that are inappropriate because these are developmental kinds of things that should be financed. Here, for example, lots of their projects don't really have hard currency. They've got about a dozen projects. But secondly, that these are corruption-riddled projects. I mean, we saw the very first loan, which Leslie Maastrup admitted was full of corruption. They had to put a halt on it. That was for Eskom, again, for some of its mid-2010s activities with Brian Molefe then in the chair. And also one after the other. And I've written a long article. It's at the website cadtm.org, where it's a Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt website, and we've gone through all the BRICS Bank loans, audited them, and they're full of corruption. I think that just makes us so disappointed that the kind of elites that have arisen in the BRICS aren't that much different. They can go into the IMF and World Bank, and they won't actually act any different than the Western elites. It's a great disappointment. We haven't had a transition in this country that really shook up the power structure economically, hence worse unemployment and inequality and poverty and ecological degradation than even in 1994.
Yeah, Professor Patrick Bond, quite interesting. I mean, the common thing from even just the two institutions we've looked at, the United Nations last week and the World Bank organization today, you see the kind of disproportionate influence wealthier countries have. And yeah, it's very clear that there is a need for reform. Thanks for chatting to us. Professor Patrick Bond is a political economist and professor at UJ's Department of Sociology.